Welcome to Evolutionary Hardcore 2.0, episode 112, 112 coming your way. Oral options to kickstart and finish cycles from Pharmaqo. Look, and we're going to discuss what kickstarting is. We're going to talk about finishing the cycle with orals. We're talking about how you're going to accomplish that. We're talking about bulking versus cutting on orals. We're talking about the best oral options from Pharmaqo. We're going to talk about the best Pharmaqo quality. So this is going to be a really fun episode. So let's start with kickstarting a little bit, Mobster. Why don't I let you start first and tell us what is kickstarting?
So it's a common idea, Steve, when we get into the whole discussion of how to put the cycle together, the importance of an AI, the importance of your diet and your training. And of course, we've discussed that on multiple shows to give people a basic understanding of where we're coming from. And then we talk about specific targets, etc. We're going to get into that, as you know, from the pre-show. So the idea behind kickstarting, and I've actually argued for and against this, mostly against it on several times with Steve on these kind of shows, is that you have chosen to use certain anabolic steroids. And for some reason or other, the theory essentially goes thus. Typically, these tend to be longer cycles. I would argue, Steve, that the kickstarting tends to be more strength slash bulking, which again we're going to get into, and the reasons why it may be a kickstart might be a good idea. But typically, as I pointed out on more than one occasion, kickstarting comes from the simple fact that you've chosen longer acting esters or blends that, for one reason or another, in the way that the parlance that we use for these shows, take a long time to build up for you to kind of notice the effects of the steroid you're using. Now, Steve and I, have, to be quite clear, have pointed out specifically, and I'm thinking of Sustanon when I say this, Steve, steroids work from day one. But the true effects of a cycle and specific choices that people are making on those cycles, sometimes you might not see for 1 or 2 weeks, maybe even a little bit longer. And it also depends how the dosing, the nature of your particular target, and how long the cycle is going to be for. In those circumstances, people say, I want to kickstart my cycle. And what they really mean is they want two things from it, Steve. They want to, A, feel that they're on, that they're getting something for their money, so to speak. And B, they want to see results more or less immediately. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It might be 1 or 2 pounds of tissue. It might be a little bit of water, for example, in the bulk. It might even be just a small strength increase in the gym. They know that the cycle choice, the rest of the plan, so to speak, is going to be, in this particular case, most effective probably from week 2, week 3 onwards. And it might well stay at that kind of level of effectiveness to the end of the cycle. So that's my understanding of the reason why. Now, I've pointed out, of course, Steve, you just need to change. You don't have to have that cycle. You don't literally need to have a kickstart. You could even argue that using a shorter ester of the very steroid that they decided to do would be more effective more quickly. And therefore, why don't they start with a shorter ester, say, for example, a short version, ester version of testosterone, and then use the longer acting forms of testosterone that they particularly want for the bulk of the cycle, and they can run a short ester for 2 weeks, and then at the same time, low dose, the longer acting ester, and then build up to the amount that they want for the rest of the cycle. So there's backwards and forwards. I think mostly in my mind, Steve, it comes down to the idea, the sensation of being on that some users get. And I'm thinking, just be patient. It makes a lot more sense, and you and I are going to discuss what that means to finish a cycle or to have finishers in a cycle. For example, to hit a certain particular percentage of body fat, to hit a certain percentage of muscle gains, or even just to be strong at the end of the cycle. And we see this all the time in professional bodybuilding, which we've also discussed on these shows. And we talk about the simple fact that for the most part, a professional bodybuilder cycle, like this weekend's Mr. Olympia, the open class, or even the classic class, it makes more sense to have longer esters at the beginning of, say, for example, a 16 or even a contest prep 21-week cycle, and then have a lot shorter esters at the end when you want to manipulate the variables and bring your athlete in the best condition you possibly can. That makes more sense to me. So I sometimes question the logic and ask the person, well, why did you choose those steroids? If that's the issue, what do you need to do? Is it There's no argument anymore, Steve, as there would have been back in the day on accessibility. We still see that in 1 or 2 countries from some of our members where it's literally, this is all I could get hold of. I can get hold of the orals, I can get Kickstarters, I can take an NFR, I can take this, I can take that. But the only form of testosterone I could get with this. And of course, you and I now know that for the most part, that lack of accessibility is no longer an excuse. You pretty much get any steroid in any amount, so long as you order ahead of time. And therefore, the reasons why you've chosen this cycle is on you, and you can easily change that. I mean, the argument goes back and forth, Steve. They could say, well, if I'm going to use a shorter rest, why can't I use a Kickstarter? So, and again, you and I have discussed this, and I kind of come around to your way of thinking a little bit in that ultimately it completely depends on the way that you think, how you like to feel on cycle, and even the reason for you doing that cycle in the first place. And maybe my experience is because I'm not a bodybuilder, I don't think in those particular terms. So though I struggle sometimes to see the reasons for a Kickstarter versus a finisher. What do you think about that?
So here's the thing, like when you're using injectable steroids, unless they have no ester attached, if you're using injectables with no esters, like test no ester, like test suspension or trend no ester, etc., then there's not going to be an ester. So it's going to be in and out of your system the same day. But most injectable anabolic steroids that we use have esters attached. So when you inject these long acting esters, that's the whole point, is because people want to be able to inject less frequently, once a week, twice a week. Hell, there's some injectables you inject once every month or once every 2 months. Libido, for example, Libido. Once you get on Libido, you're injecting Libido like once every 2 months, even 3 months, even. So it just depends on what you're using. So the most common esters are going to be, let's say cypionate or enanthate. When we're talking about most anabolic steroids, enanthate, for example, is a very popular ester. But let's take the example of cypionate. In cypionate, when it comes to half-life, you're looking at a 10-day half-life. Now, does that mean you have to inject it every 10 days? No. Does it mean you have to inject it every 7 days? No. But what I'm trying to explain is you can take the half-life of any injectable steroid and multiply it by 4 or 5, and that will tell you approximately how long it takes to reach peak levels in your system. So if you start taking test SIP on a cycle, it's not going to reach peak levels for 40 or 50 days. Okay? That's a long time. So that's like 5 or 6 weeks at least until it reaches peak levels. But it's still, as Mobster said earlier, it's still doing something after you inject it, but it's not reaching peak levels. So the idea behind the kickstart is during that 4, 5, 6 weeks that long ester injectable is getting to peak levels. And the same can go for equipoise, which also has a long ester. Deca, Primo has an enanthate ester in most situations. So these steroids, they all take many weeks to reach peak and level. So people say, you know what? I want to feel it. Like Mobster said, I want to feel it. It's like buying an orange tree. Do you buy a little baby orange tree that's going to take like 6 years to start bearing fruit? Or do you buy those, or do you spend the extra $200 and get the really big orange tree that already has oranges on it? So you can start enjoying the oranges right away. It's the same thing. And so a lot of people will make the decision that, yeah, I'm going to stack an oral in the cycle. So I'll do an oral the first 4 or 5 weeks while the long estered injectable is starting to build in my body. Now, my Mobster is not a big fan of kickstarting. I've always done kickstarting, especially when I first started using anabolic steroids. That was a thing everyone did. Back in the 90s, 2000s, everybody, you'd see their cycles laid out. They'll do a 12-week cycle, or a 10-week cycle, or a 15-week cycle, and you'll see they'll run equipoise or primo or testosterone or deca or anything like that. And then they'll always start the cycle off with an oral to kickstart. That was standard for everyone. Then I'm not really sure, Mobster, when that started or who started it, but a lot of times you see these types of things. Someone makes mention of it, and then everybody starts parroting it, and then everyone starts doing it. But like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like you want to start enjoying things right away. Like I'll give you an example. The first cycle I ever ran, I did Sustanon, I did Deca, right? And those take a long time to reach peak in the system. And I didn't want to wait 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks even for these
Why?
to speak in the system.
Why, Steve?
So
Why? I mean,
what I did is
you
I used Dianabol, which kicks in really quick. Dianabol only has like a 4 or 5 hour half life, so it's kicking in within the first couple days. And by the end of the first week, I was already getting strength benefits. Instead of doing
yeah,
6 reps, I was doing 8 reps on the same weight. I was like, wow, I'm starting to feel this. I don't want to wait 4 or 5 weeks. So
yeah, but that's
that's
the question, Steve. Between the two of us, you and I have probably been training close to 60, maybe even 70 years. I've been training for 45 years. Steve's been training probably 20 something years at least, right? So we're probably coming up on maybe between the two of us close to 70 years training. And we know from that 70 years training, we didn't take steroids straight away. We took a long time to get to use steroids. We kind of arguably sort of learned the trade a little bit in terms of training and nutrition and whatever else. I suspect there's an element of the modern society type thing in terms of, well, now that I've decided to take steroids, I'm not going to hang about. I want it now. And that's the reason why, of course, we go out and buy the big screen TVs and the nice cars and go on the expensive holidays. And we don't want to wait. We're not patient. And yet, ironically, as I say, you and I have spent between us close to 70 years. And probably, if again, as an average, I didn't take steroids until I'd been training for 22 years. So the idea that I need to rush, I'm going to be training until they fucking nail the lid on my coffee nut. I would like to think so anyway. And even if I'm not strong or big or muscular when I'm finished, I would still want to be the idea that I'm going to put another 15 or 20 years training in before it's my time to go. So I'm not that impatient in that particular regards. I do get it though. I think there's a sort of element of, and maybe the anabolic thing in and of itself is part of that reasoning. And so if I'm going to take anabolics, why the fuck can't I see results? But again, the long-term view for me is, and again, this I think is also a typical person that uses a gym. Most gym owners do very well if they can keep a new member for more than 16 weeks. If you've been training for a couple of years, you're probably going to be training for the rest of your life or be doing something to keep in shape for the rest of your life. So therefore, for me, if you then decide you're going to go into steroids, if you're that much of a rush, are you going to be in and out of the game, quote unquote, in 2 years? That seems to be a bit of an average. So maybe that's an element or percentage of it. This is just a piece of a sort of monsterish advice, or mobsterish advice, should I say. And this is, guys, don't necessarily need to be in a rush and think long term. I like the idea that our listeners are going to be training for 20 or 30 years. That they're in this journey, the iron game, lifting weights, getting in shape for hopefully as long as they possibly can and physically capable of. Some of you will not, and some of you will be impatient. So we will give you advice when we're doing this show on how you can do these things so that you can enjoy, if you want to, quicker, etc., etc. As I said, it makes more sense for me for the bulking and specifically the cutting in terms of finishing, because I can see that you've got a certain result on cycle, and we're going to talk about finishing momentarily. And you want to get that polish, you want to have a certain particular look, and there are variables to be manipulated at the end of a cycle, including, as per today's Pharmaqo finishers, orals, versus the idea that you need to be in a rush at the beginning. So it makes more sense to me from that perspective. And again, I'm thinking a professional athlete, Steve. Does a professional athlete need to be bigger or more muscular straight away? No. Do they need to be fast today? No. If it was a sprinter, Steve, they need to be faster on the day of the competition. The Mr. Olympia, again, as an example, no good them looking amazing as a couple of the top pros did weeks ago. They need to look amazing on Friday night and Saturday night. So that's the way that I think. And again, guys, most of you are going to be doing a cycle for one reason or another, whether it's bulking or cutting, and you need really to look your best at the finish. You need to be the strongest, you need to be the most muscular, you need to be the leanest at the end of your cycle, for a modeling gig, for a holiday, for a competition, or just for your goddamn pleasure. But yes, we understand, again, there is a percentage of people that do like the idea of how they feel, specifically when they're on testosterone, all the different versions that we're going to discuss, and the idea of once I'm on, therefore I want to be on in that terms of that sensation straight away. Is there an argument to be made, Steve? I've also talked about this before. Every single time I've asked about kickstarting, I've always said to the guys, I put this challenge out. Did kickstarting improve the end result? And I have yet to have someone come back and say to me, I gained 3 more pounds of tissue. I was 15% stronger. I was that much more muscular. I would like to see that, because then that to me backs up the idea that starting that way improves the end game, it improves the end result. Finishing, 100%. But again, guys, this is your choice, so we're going to assist you with your choice. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, so let's get into finishing more and kind of explain what it is, Mobster. So, I'll let you go first on this. Explain what finishing. A lot of people don't know. They'll get advice from someone or something on the
Yeah.
forum. Oh, you should finish the cycle. Why don't you explain what that means
Right,
exactly?
let me preface this again, because I've a brief explanation just now, but I want to clarify a couple of points. So, for example, and I'll do it from the bodybuilding perspective, the getting into shape for holiday, modeling gig, whatever else, and specifically in my case, strength. Okay, so let's start with what I know, which is strength. I have trained multiple times for big competitions, British and European championships, and my training cycle typically from when I started preparing for the competition, for the events of that competition, to the day of the competition, were average 12 to 16 weeks. I actually think for the most part, these 16 weeks. Now, from a performance point of view, the idea that I would be strong or as strong as I'm ever going to be, ideally, from day one makes no sense. You should have a peak of physical strength at the end of the cycle. The fucking day of the competition, Steve. That's when I need to be my strongest. There is nothing in my training. I would literally be starting at 60, 70, 80%. And at the end, I need to be 100%, or actually, ideally, the way that I would normally program it is 105%. In other words, 5% better than the last time I competed. So that when I went to the competition, I was as strong or stronger than I'd been previously, and therefore, hopefully, as happened 4 times at the British and 2 times at the European, kick ass. Not every single time. Sometimes someone else beat me. They were stronger, etc. For a bodybuilding competition, that makes sense as well. You start a little bit out of shape, but you finish in the best goddamn shape of your life. That's what's supposed to happen. You're leanest, you're most muscular, you're most conditioned, the least amount of water under your skin, etc., etc. Now, for the average Joe, whether it's a modeling gig or a beach holiday, challenge, or just goddamn getting into shape, the same thing should apply. We hope that you aren't too fat, out of shape, etc. at the beginning, but by the end of your cycle, by the end of your plan, by the end of your diet, by the end of your training, you should be in the best shape you've been, whether that's for the last year, for the last 10 years, or in your goddamn life. If you started off with a 1-pack, we want you to have a 3-pack or a 4-pack. If you started with a little bit of fat over your love handles, we want your obliques to be tight. If you started with big legs but smooth legs, we want quad separation. And again, this whether it's for a holiday or whatever else. So the finishing thing is you are, and again, I take this from professional bodybuilding. You start in a certain amount of shape and condition. You diet your ass off, you fast. We'll talk about that on other shows. You work your ass off in the gym. And as you're going along, let's call it a 16-week cycle again, Steve. It doesn't have to be 16 weeks on PEDs, but 16 weeks getting in shape. First 4 weeks might just be training and diet manipulation. Call that pre-cycle work. The next 12 weeks would be a longer cycle. And 8 weeks might be moderate amounts of tissue being added, etc., etc. When you get about halfway through, so you're 8 weeks into your complete 16 weeks in, maybe 9, 10 weeks, you start to look for things that you can improve on. Is how long are the S's that you're using? Are they causing you to hold a little bit of water? Can you manipulate your AI? Can you flush the system? Can you use natural diuretics? Do you need to do more cardio? You go and talk to your coach. You go and talk to the PT at the gym. You come onto the forum. You ask us, okay, we actually see that your fat's a little tiny bit higher. Bring that down. Next week, you start to see more tissue. You start to see more muscle shining. The week after that, and so on and so forth. Right. That longer acting ester, you need to stop that now. You need to bring a shorter ester in. Perhaps you need to do a little bit more clenbuterol. And what we're doing, what a prep coach would do, what a good coach that you're working with, and prep coaching as often as not is working with the PED side as much as it is the actual diet and training work. You need to prop your delts out more, etc., etc. So by the end of the cycle, you should be the leanest, the most muscular, the best shape you've ever had in your fucking life. Now, that might not be the case 4 weeks out. And here's where finishers have their place. This is where diet variables has its place. This is where fasting comes in. And again, it might just be that you've been training okay, but you need to take things up a notch. It might be that you've had a moderate amount on cycle, and maybe you need to boost the amount of steroids you're taking. Only a little bit, Steve, as you know. That's got you so far, but you've got 4 weeks to go. Sometimes what we also see, Steve, is people peak early in terms of their physical gains, in terms of the muscle gains. Okay, you're not going to gain another 2-3 pounds of tissue in the last 3-4 weeks. But what we can do is cut your water. What we can do is cut your calories. What we can do is up your cardio. And what we can do is help you with a finisher. Just going to bring out those last bits of detail. Winstall's another example, Steve, that we might put in towards the end, orally or it's an injectable, to dry you out. We might, for example, get you on a natural diuretic like dandelion root, just to get rid of the excess water. We might actually have you ingest more water. And these are all the small things that even on the forums we can do for you to get you that. Basically, Steve, we want, via these podcasts, via the forums, the best result that you can have. We want you to be successful. That promotes us. It works for the forums. It inspires other people that are looking in. And therefore, the idea that we get you into the best shape possible, just with a few suggestions, just by having you tweak something, because after all, Steve, they're doing the work. They're the ones that are suffering with the cardio and the diet. We're not. We're the ones that are just making these little suggestions. And who knows? The last 3-4 weeks is probably when most people would transform the most as well. So that, I think, again, where finishing has its place, because that's where all that hard work and all that dieting and all that cardio suddenly seems to start to come together. And you literally see, we've seen this again and again, including professional bodybuilders, top athletes, etc. Okay. Oh my God, he looks amazing. So literally those 4, 5, 6 weeks of a 16 or 20-week cycle preparation, whatever you want to call it, is where the magic starts to happen. So therefore, the idea of oral finishes here, quick in, quick out, giving you that effect, polishing the diamond, Steve. It's a rough stone, and now it looks absolutely fucking amazing. It's glinting, it's brilliant. Same thing. You've gone from 1-pack to 8-pack, from no separation to separation, and you start to look like what we think a bodybuilder looks like. And we've seen this again and again and again. And it can absolutely, the transformation photographs, even on a week-by-week basis, or typically a little bit longer. Oh my God, you had shape, you had a brilliant silhouette, but now I can see you looking like a bodybuilder. Now I can see what all that work's done. Now I can see what's happening. And trust me, guys, it's actually really hard physically, but it will G you up. It will inspire you, and you will start to actually feel almost comfortable with the hard work and the dieting and the fasting and the cardio, because you will see the work, the results right there in front of you in the mirror, in the photographs, with the comments that you're getting, etc., etc. And people will literally start to notice the transformation in those last 4 weeks or so. What do you think on that, Steve?
So when it comes to finishing, most people, and Mobster kind of talked about powerlifting. Let's say you're going into a powerlifting competition. You're worried about strength. I want to peak. Obviously, when it comes to that, or it comes to bodybuilding, it don't matter. The judges in the bar, where that's showing how strong you are, they don't care where you were 4 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago or 12 weeks ago. It's that day. The person who was the best 4 weeks ago don't mean shit. It's just like you watch a football game and the team's up by 20 points at halftime. Okay, that's great. But you don't win anything if you're up 20 points at halftime. It's who's ahead when there's zero.
Yeah, full time. The only result that matters at the end of the game.
So a lot of times what people will do, especially who compete, in open bodybuilding, physique, whatever, they'll want to run a finisher at the end to really look their best at the end. That's where you can really take advantage of these Pharmaqo orals. And they love to use orals because they're flexible. That's the advantage of using orals, both to kickstart and to finish cycles, is they're flexible. They kick in quickly. Any of these orals, really the half-life is less than 24 hours. So they're going to be kicking in within that first week. So if you want to really, really cut up and dry out going into your competition or going into your a wedding, you want to fit into your wedding outfit, you're going to the beach for a vacation, you're doing a modeling gig, whatever it happens to be, or you just want to get pictures done so you can put it up on a dating app or on your Facebook to kind of show your body off. Finishing is the key, because you can finish with these Pharmaqo orals that we're going to talk about later in this podcast. and they will make you more dry. They will make you more shredded. They will make you more cut. They'll make you more vascular. So you're looking your very best on that day. So that's why a lot of people like to finish with these these orals. And a huge advantage in a bodybuilding competition, as Mobster mentioned, to finish with Winstrol, because Winstrol is the best steroid at drying you out. So you want to look dry as hell. If you go on stage and you have just a little bit of blow, a little bit of fluffiness to your muscles, it's going to count against you. The judges are going to knock points on that, okay, or they're going to add points to that, and that's not good. You want to be better than the person next to you, so they're using these orals, the Anivars, the Winstrols, all these orals that they're using. We're going to talk about them later in the podcast, but they're using them, so you've got to use them as well. And they didn't start using them halfway through the cycle for 4 weeks, in the middle of the cycle for 4 weeks. They're using them at the end. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll cut off injectables going into the finish. We talked about on prior podcasts. Trenbolone, testosterone, a lot of these injectables, they cause inflammation in the body. They cause water retention in the body, in the testosterone's case. So what they'll do is they'll cut them off 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead of time, unless they're using a shorter ester version of those. And they want those orals to be in their system because they want to look as cut and as shredded as possible on that day where they're on stage and those judges are looking at them. So that's the whole purpose of finishers. And if you're an average Joe, it's the same thing. You're running the cycle, you want to it's like icing on the cake. You want to look your very best finishing out that cycle. This way you can look yourself in the mirror and be like, okay, you get a visual snapshot of what you look like. And then on your next cycle, you can visually think, you know what, I want to beat the way I looked before. And then each time you want to beat. So you want to get more body fat off. You want to get more muscle on. You want to get more vascularity and more cut. So you keep improving. And that's what it's all about. So that's the whole purpose for finishers. Mobster, you want to touch on that before we move on to the next one?
I think Steve's exactly dead on there, guys. And again, it makes more sense in that particular situation, certainly more than the whole Kickstarter thing, because ultimately, as I say earlier in the show, Steve, reality of this thing isn't necessarily how you feel. It's what you look like at the end, the peak results, whether it's strength or cutting or bulking or whatever else. End game only. I would actually argue, Steve, and me and you talked about this briefly in the pre-show, there might be a little bit more sense in my mind for the bulking option, which we will discuss now in terms of kickstarting, because I think there's a phrase about leaving gains on the table. And let me give you what would be an absolutely amazing kind of result. People think these kind of gains are common, but they're not. But let's say, for example, Steve, you did a 12-week cycle. It's all bulking. We're not going to go crazy and get fat or really, really out of shape here. So we're going to go somewhere between lean bulking and the old version of bulking, with a little bit of fat, a little bit of soft tissue. But for the most part, the majority of what we're gaining here, 80%, is muscle and a little bit of water and a little bit of fat, just to allow for the new growth. If you gain 10 pounds, that would be amazing. So there's an argument to be made if the cycle that you've chosen to do is a little bit more long-acting over those 10 or 12 weeks, then the idea that you could do something at the beginning that enabled you to gain an extra pound or two of tissue, for example, again here, Debo, which pretty much I gained from more or less day one, Steve. We talked about this on other shows, and I know that you're the same. So the idea, for example, in that situation, that we could take something that's going to give us a pound or two of tissue right away, and hopefully we keep as much of that tissue right from the beginning all the way through to the end. So instead of gaining 8 pounds, we gain 9 or 10 pounds. That makes a lot of sense to me. The finishing thing, as I said already, makes way more sense in terms of getting in shape, end game results, etc., etc. Because either way, whether it's bulking, whether it's strength, whether it's cutting, what you do at the beginning is great, but like Steve said, the judges don't care. What you do at the end, when you're doing a photo shoot, when you're going on holiday, when you're doing a modeling gig, whether you're doing a competition, that's when these things count. That's the end game result. Of course, in the case, as I say, of a bulk, the idea that you might have left 1 or 2 pounds of tissue on the table, that starts to make sense as well. And again, it's just things like manipulating variables in diet and cardio, conditioning, fasting, etc., etc. You very rarely manipulate at those beginning. It's nearly always once the cycle's underway and we see where there's a few things that maybe could be improved. That doesn't happen day one. You really have to fuck it up from day one for us to want to help you and sort something out in the first week or two. 9 times out of 10, you want to see how that person's getting on, is what they're doing, working, etc., etc. So let's talk about bulking versus cutting in this particular situation, Steve, in regards to the way that we would talk about oral options and different steroids that we would use. And again, this is still bulking and cutting, finishing and kickstarting again. So back to you for a second.
Yeah, and as Mobster said, it makes logic to start with something like, for example, Dianabol, if you want to gain that first week. And that's what I did when I first ran my first cycle. You gain a lot of weight and mass, so you get a big jump start, and it's a great way to kickstart the cycle if that's what you're looking for. Because by the time the other bulking injectables kick in and are at their peak, then you already got a jump start on that. Your weight's already going up, your mass is already going up, your weight's already going up. But that doesn't necessarily mean every time you have to kickstart that way. Because some people like to kickstart, and I've done this myself, with something like Anavar. In Pharmaqo, they have awesome Anavar. We're going to talk more about Pharmaqo products on the next segment. But let me just say, like, let's say you want your cycle, your goal of your cycle is to recomp or even the cut. So Anavar is a mild option that doesn't aromatize into estrogen, and you can use it to kickstart your cycle that way. So when it comes to bulking or cutting, although I think most people out there will tend to kickstart, with more of a bulking oral, I don't necessarily think that a lot of people, especially now, Mobster, I think more in the 80s, 90s, back when people were coming from a skinnier physique trying to get bigger. Now people are coming from more of a bigger physique trying to get leaner because
Yes.
we're all big, in America.
Yes.
We're
Yes.
all big.
Very
Unless
true.
you're
Yeah.
unless you're like a meth head or unless you've got really skinny genetics, like you've
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
been anorexic your whole life
Yeah.
and you get old. Once you start getting your 20, it just seems like everybody gains weight. It's hard to find a person who's not always trying to either recomp or cut. And things have changed. And in the bodybuilding world, the same way. We see bodybuilders, they're already big. Putting on muscle, no problem at all. It's cutting. Whoever can cut the most going into a competition without sacrificing the muscle in the process, that's the person who has the advantage. They're still big, but they're also cut. That's why you see people who are 250 pounds or 260 pounds at 5 or 6% body fat. Like, it's mind boggling because they got really, really big and then they made them a cut. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you're kickstarting that you have to, uh, bulk up. And on the flip side, when it comes to finishing, everyone thinks, oh, I gotta cut, oh, I gotta look good for the wedding, or I gotta look good for, but it doesn't necessarily mean. Monster brought up a big point earlier. What if you're going into a powerlifting competition and you want to be your strongest on that day? It don't matter if you're the strongest dude 4 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago. You got to be strongest that day. So maybe you want to run an oral to bulk you up. You've got room, you got to make your weight, but you've got like 4 or 5 pounds to spare. So you want to be at the highest weight possible while also staying in your weight class. That would give you even that 1 pound or 2 pound difference or 5 ounce difference, whatever it happened to be, will make a big difference against your competition. And the bulking steroids will add strength in most cases more than the cutting steroids. So it doesn't necessarily mean, yeah, I'm finishing the cycle with a cutter. Oh, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that. There's no rule. But I think 80% of the time, officer, people will start their cycle with more of a bulking attitude as a kickstart, and then they'll finish their cycle with more of a cutting bias, but doesn't necessarily mean it has to be that way. So really, at the end of the day, we're going to give you the options on this
Yes.
podcast and then make you
Yes.
decide what you want to do and try different things. This time you might want to do the bulk kickstart and the cut finisher. The next time you might want to try the opposite and see how it goes, or you might want to do both. You might want to bulk and bulk or cut and cut. So it try different things and you might realize, wow, Trying something different really is fun. It's more fun this way, than just doing the same thing over and over again and doing the cliche of, yeah, I want to start as a bulk as a kickstart and then do a finisher as a cut, and then you just get kind of bored of that and you want to do something more challenging. And you're like, fuck it. I want to cut to start the cycle and I want to bulk to finish the cycle. I want to do something a little different.
I would dispute the idea that I'm going to manipulate drugs just for the challenge, Steve. I think, again, look, it comes from where you're starting from. It comes from what you want to end up. It's as simple as that, really. And for the great and vast majority of the time, I think the only reason that Steve and I start thinking the way that Steve just described is because we've been doing this a while. We've done multiple cycles. And the idea that you're somehow fixed on a particular plan is silly. And we've actually discussed that. We've even pointed this out. We said, listen, right, if the cycle's not working out, if the reason, for example, Steve, halfway through the cycle, the holiday that you was going to might get cancelled. The modeling gig you might have been planning to get into shape for might disappear. That contract might drop, might be lost. Something might happen. And that's life, right? So the idea that you can change stuff and you can be flexible is absolutely something that we need to think about. I've done these shows with Steve in the past when I was rigid as fuck. Well, that's the plan, Steve. That's what I want to do. Why would I change it? Well, I've got that kind of life. I could do that. But the reality is that's not the same for our listeners. I was semi-retired, working part-time when I was doing those competitions. I've been doing that for years. So I had a lot more time to concentrate on these things and go to these international events and travel around the world to Sweden and America and Germany and Spain and stuff for me to compete. But that's not our typical listener. Our typical listener has a day job, is studying at college, and shit happens. The surprise holiday that my fiance has just bought for me, guys. I've only got 4 weeks to get into shape, right, motherfucker? You need to change what you're doing. So absolutely, I wouldn't change it just for the crack of doing it arse about face, Steve. That makes no sense to me. But yes, life means certain times you have to change the plan. It might be, for example, you get ill. There might be some sort of medical stressful life situation. And stress can fuck up a cycle. It really can. It can cause things to happen to your body that you'd be surprised about. We don't realize how goddamn hormonal or how hormonal we are, Steve, or how much stress can affect us. So just stuff like that, a funeral, a relationship finishing, a divorce, and fuck with you big time. Make you want to go on a binge, yeah. So plans change. So absolutely, the idea that you can has to be done in this particular way, no. The stuff there. But for the most part, a well-planned, well thought out, plenty of time to think about the end game kind of stuff typically works this way. And why do we talk about things like that? Because ultimately we know that those things will produce the best results. A plan that you've had to change half-assed, halfway through is not going to give you the best result. You can't go from a bulk into a cut, 6 weeks of the bulk, and then change it into a cut and expect the cut to be as successful as though you've done it for 12 weeks. Same thing with the bulk, Steve. Starting with a cut because that was thing. Oh, but now that thing that I was doing it for has disappeared. I can go to the bulk. You probably leave 2, 3, 4 pounds of tissue on the table. That makes sense to me again in that particular regards. But to say that it has to be done this way, no, absolutely not. But for the most part, you will have greater success, a better end result, should be the real greatest aim on the table here. If you plan these things out in advance, manipulate the variables where they need to be manipulated, but only to get the end result to be the best it should have been. And again, like I say, there's other bits and pieces that can go in there. So it's not carved in stone, guys. It's not up there on Mount Rushmore that it has to be done in this particular way. But again, it's about the majority of people over the years that have been doing steroids, etc., having the greatest amount of success. For example, we know, Steve, cutting, bulking, whatever you guys are doing, the ones that meal prep have the best success. The ones that have training logs have the best success. The ones that are consistently applying themselves have the best success when it comes to getting into shape. Those of you that fast 16, 17, 18 hours a day seem to be having the greatest success. Those of you that do the cardio, whether you want to do it or not, get up early and get it done, seem to have the greatest success. So those things apply to the great majority of listeners that are listening to this show. Let's talk about, Steve, specific approaches that we would use now in terms of dosaging, cycling, etc., etc.
Yeah, so let's go over. Like, Pharmaqo has many different oral options to serve your needs, whether you're doing an oral kickstart, to a cycle or you're finishing a cycle. So Mobster and I, look, we're going to go over a list. So we're going to talk about each one and we're going to kind of give our opinion on whether it'd be better for kickstarting or better for finishing. Now, before we do, just keep in mind, you can use any of these. Okay. You can use
Yes.
any of these at any point in your cycle, but we're just going to have a little fun on this. And we're going to give you the way we would do it. And we're going to explain why. So let's start with the first one, Super Droll Mobster. Kickstarter finisher. How would you do it?
Kickstarter.
Okay. Why?
Right, because we know that it comes with certain side effects for some people. We know that it is an actual steroid, not a pro-hormone as it was used back in the day. We know that dosing can make a big difference in this particular one. And again, for example, with some users, you might see a little bit of water retention just because of the toxic side effects that can exist with it. I suspect it could be an either or, Steve, but it would literally come down to the user's response. So we might change that to a Kickstarter only, for example, if this person's having dry gains. What do you think on the Super Droll?
Yeah, so with the Super Droll, the side effects are insane. So if you're stacking it, it might be a good idea, a better idea to stack it at the beginning. Because this way, if you're using a long ester, you won't feel those side effects for later on. So you can kind of deal with the Super Droll side effects in the short term. So definitely, kickstarting makes sense on it because it's really going to give you a big jump on your cycle, especially if you're looking for strength. Now, in terms of dosing, I would go anywhere. I would start at anywhere from 10 to 20 milligrams. 30 milligrams would be the absolute max. I would do it. And I
Yes.
wouldn't go more than 3 or 4 weeks max. All right. So
What
next
about
one.
yeah,
Yep.
Halo?
Yeah. Why don't you do Halo? Because you've used it before. What do you think?
I've tried
Kickstart,
Halo,
finish it.
and annoyingly for me, I didn't get much out of it. For in my world, in what I train for, etc., it would be a finisher. And the reason for that is thus. Again, I'm a strength athlete, not a bodybuilder, just to be clear. Steve's more the bodybuilder than I am, which is why we can have these back and forths. So Halo for me is a peak strength slash aggression type drug. You almost want to be irritated by it. I don't know that I'd want it as a Kickstarter for that reason, Steve. I don't want to feel grouchy and toxic or whatever. Whereas I don't mind that from a strength athlete point of view because I want that level of aggression. I want that, come on, let's go. Let's fucking kick ass on the day of a competition, on the day that I'm lifting or a challenge that I've set for myself. Annoyingly, I've done very well on other drugs that have done that in terms of, for example, check drops, but I didn't get anything from a Halo. But it does work for lots of listeners and lifters and users. And again, actually, arguably with this one, I don't see most users using it long term. They don't need to have high dosages for it, Steve. 30 milligrams is about as much as I'd want to take it. From recollection, I've never seen anybody run Halo long term for a long cycle. So arguably a small dose, anywhere between 10 and at the maximum 30 milligrams. And from what I've seen again on this is other gurus as well as ourselves, never for more than 2 to 3 weeks. 3 weeks, 4 weeks is an absolute maximum. It's relatively toxic. That's kind of how it works, including your aggression. So would I want to kickstart with this? No. Would I want to finish with this? Yes. And again, for the reasons I said. In terms of lean muscular gains from a bodybuilding perspective, again, finisher. What do you think on Halo, Stephen? How would you dose the cycle?
Yeah, I think if you're going to a powerlifting competition, you could use it as a finisher. This way, you're peaking right at the right time. That's the way I would do it. Now, Anavar, Pharmaqo has options. They have a great option for females, Mobster. Tell the listeners about that one.
Yeah, so a couple of companies do this, and Pharmaqo does this as well for sure, Steve. We talk about the dosing options for Anavar, and we've got some great numbers for the men, but women, this is one of the safer oral steroids you can take. And Femavar, I actually only heard about this recently, and I don't know why, probably because it just hasn't come up on other shows and comments by even other quote unquote steroid gurus, etc. Femavar is essentially perfectly dosed, 2.5 milligrams, which means you could split it if you want to go as low as 1.25. But when we talk about dosage for women, we very rarely talk about much more than 5 milligrams. So Femavar is essentially a low dose form of Anavar that is perfect for women, much easier to split the pill, go as low as you like, ladies, and get that perfect dose for what you're likely to do. So having that sort of 2.5 milligrams, Steve, I'd probably have avoided a female strength athlete, for example, no more need for them to run it more than 5 milligrams a day. Maybe if someone's peaking for a competition. In terms of kickstarting or finishing, both. I would use this throughout a whole strength cycle as a strength athlete, and I have done. In terms of lean muscular gains, whether that's a lean bulk rather than what we would call a wet bulk, vis-a-vis debulk again, or again, drying out for a competition, getting those lean muscular gains going into a cut, and again, diet and conditioning on point. And the dosage would probably be the same, Steve. 30, again, it depends what the rest of the cycle is. I run this solo, and solo 50 milligrams a day. Absolutely no problem. If I had other products, other injectables, other orals, etc., in the cycle, I might prefer a lower dose. And that's more to do with the overall end results. And again, the manipulation of the finishing versus the kickstart. But I'd actually say, Steve, Anavar is a great kickstarter and a finisher. If you're on other products, 30 milligrams a day, I'd probably have you maxing out on. And again, that might be for the whole length of the cycle. It might be the first couple of weeks. It might be the last couple of weeks. My preference has always been to run this all the way through the cycle. And option for me has always been 50 milligrams. But I actually think Anavar is both. You can't really put it one or the other with Anavar.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, Anavar up to 8 weeks. And look, at the end of the day, kickstarting, I talked about kickstarting it earlier. Finishing also popular, but I would go more kickstarting with this one. And I would run it like your first half of your cycle. I think it'd be really good, especially if you're recomping or you're cutting. The next one we're gonna talk about is your favorite mobster, and that's Dianabol. And Dianabol, look, I talked about earlier on the podcast. I used it my first steroid stack. I used Dianabol and I used it to kickstart to really get a jump start on my strength and
Yeah,
mass. And I put
yeah,
on, I was putting on like lots of strength the first couple weeks thanks to using it. So you want to use 30 milligrams on average, but some people use up to 50 milligrams.
yeah.
That's a lot. I wouldn't go any higher than that. And you run it about 4 weeks on average. So if you're going to kickstart it, I would do first 4 weeks. Would you kickstart or finish with Dynable Mobster?
But in this circumstances, Steve, for the great and vast majority of the listeners, and what most people would want listening to this show, kickstart. Purely and simply, you would not have this as a finisher on a cut. Absolutely, certainly would on a. You could run this from start to finish on a bulk, but in terms of the average listener, what they want is probably going to be lean muscular gains, kickstarting for sure. And it comes down to what I said earlier in the show, which is not leaving any gains on the table. I have told the story multiple times of no dose whatsoever, fake Dianabol pills, which were given to me, so at least I didn't waste the money, Steve. And I think I had 10 days of those and nothing happened. And because I'd fucked up the one and only time I've done this, where I'd literally not planned a cycle properly and the product didn't arrive till after the planned cycle had started, the day that the legitimate product turned up from an approved source, I started taking that Friday, and from Friday through to Monday, 4 days, I gained a pound a day. So for the idea of kickstarting makes absolute sense for me. Again, majority listeners, if you're bulking, you can run this all the way through. If you're cutting, just at the beginning. And we're talking about professional bodybuilders and other athletes and how they start at the beginning with muscle tissue and size and keeping the muscle on, etc., etc., etc. And definitely you could take this out. It's in and out of your system relatively quickly. So length of time, let's say it's a 12-week cycle, you use another steroids, I would just put this in the first 4 weeks. And you could even maybe, Steve, just on this drug alone, maybe gain 8 pounds, certainly 4 to 6 pounds in those first few weeks. And then obviously lose the water, get into better shape with the latter part of the cycle. So absolutely a Kickstarter for me. Dosaging wise, I have seen as high both the Anavar and the Dynabol, ironically, Steve, for competing bodybuilders of 50 to 100 milligrams. But I prefer, again, for me, Dynabol seems to be the most effective in my personal experience between 30 and 50. 50, if I'm running it solo, I might have it again as a Kickstarter at 30 milligrams a day, first 2 to 4 weeks for me as part of an overall cycle, depending on what else I'm doing. What do you think on that one before we move on?
Yeah, yeah. And then the next one, Tyrannoble. Now, this is a weaker oral, but I really like it. I like it for athletic purposes. So a dosage to try is 30 to 40 milligrams a day. And look, I think on this one, I'm going to do a little cheat on this one, Monster. I'm going to say you can kickstart it and you can finish with Turinabol and the same cycle. So if you're doing like a 12-week cycle, you can do the first 4 or 5 weeks with T-Bol, then take a little
Yeah.
break, and then finish 4 or 5 weeks. How about you, Monster? Kickstart or finish?
Actually, the way you've just described it makes sense to me, Steve. And I'll tell the listeners why. Okay. Turinabol, like Steve said, is quite mild. You really don't need to be using more than 20 milligrams a day. And here's how this would work. Okay. At the beginning, you'd probably be looking to assist the rest of the cycle. Again, this is a Kickstarter in that example, in terms of you getting into shape as quickly as possible. We're certainly starting to see some shape at the beginning of the cycle. At the end, I will touch upon what I've talked about before, Steve, which is quite simply the end of your cycle should be where it's fucking hard work. You should be cutting your calories, you should be fasting, you should be kind of tired because you're training your asses off. You're getting up and doing your steps, you're doing your cardio, you're climbing the Stairmaster, you're rowing the rowing machine, you're working your ass off to get into shape. And where Turinabol would shine in that example is it's going to be a little bit like other steroids, Steve, in terms of keeping some of your hard-earned muscle gains on. In other words, you don't lose those as you get into shape, dropping fat and muscle. No, you're trying to retain the muscle. And equally, also assisting you with the cardiovascular side. We know that what the reasons, as we discussed on other shows, is particularly developed for athletes, meaning people that combination of strength and cardiovascular conditioning required in athletics. And so the idea that you keep some cardiovascular ability is going to assist you with the grind. It's going to help you have that small sense of energy, etc., etc. That to me makes more sense as a finisher. So Steve's actually right. The idea you get into a little bit of shape, kick-started, do the rest of the cycle, and then the last couple of weeks when it's really, to coin a phrase, Steve, your ass is hanging out, your tongue's hanging out, you're not sure you're going to get through to the end. Turinabol comes in and gives you that little bit of an energy boost, a little bit more cardiovascular ability. Suddenly the cardio gets that tiny bit easier. The dieting gets that tiny bit easier to do because you have that little sense of well-being, a little sense of energy, more the energy, Steve, and the ability to do these things when really you're low carbs, you're low fat, you're fasting 16, 17 hours a day, but you still got that sense of energy and well-being at the end. That's when it's super tough. What about the next one, Steve? Because we know that there are different options, of course, as there are with some of the other products we talked about. Typically, Pharmaqo does both 10s and 50 milligrams, for example. In the case of Yanadar, Winstrol, it comes also in 10 and 50 milligram options. So what about this one for you, Steve? Cutter or bulker? Finisher or
Yeah, so
kickstart?
this one all day finisher, man, all day. I don't see any benefit to kickstarting with Winstrol at all
I
because
agree.
why would you fuck up your joints and your hair right at the
Yeah,
beginning of the
that's what I
cycle?
was thinking. Can you
Might as
imagine
well just
starting the cycle dry?
yeah, so
Yeah,
finish
yeah,
it. This is a
yes,
finisher all day for
yes,
me. So
yes.
25 to 50 milligrams a day is all you need. And this will shred you up. And you can add it to any of your cycles. Anadrol. This is an interesting one. I think for the most part, use it like as a dry bulker, and I would do it as a kickstart because Anadrol is one of those that it's going to you're gonna tell the difference. Like if you're on Anadrol for 4 weeks, it will change your physique. You know,
Yeah,
so what's cool is with the Anadrol, I would use it to kickstart because if you're using like equipoise or long ester testosterone or something, and you're going to wait 4 or 5 weeks for those to kick in. So Anadrol is going to be making changes the first 4 weeks. It's like the orange tree example I gave you at the beginning, Monster. I don't want to wait 5, 6 years to be eating oranges off my tree. I want to eat oranges this season. So fuck, I'm going to get the Anadrol and kickstart with the Anadrol to start out. This is a great way to do it.
I agree with you, Steve. And I think the main reason for my thinking in that particular regards is Anadrol run at higher dosages for a long cycle. I would argue potentially because we know that you can have the lean gains, etc., that some users get. I've heard of Anadrol people gaining huge amounts, and I wouldn't want them to use high amounts and get more water and more size, etc., etc. There's actually a point for the average sized person where, if you gained and gained and gained and gained, it would actually be ridiculous and actually physically uncomfortable. So even for the people that respond really, really well, I also think running this long all the way through for say 12 or more weeks might be an issue in terms of toxicity and side effects, etc. So I'd actually agree with Steve in that particular regards. If you respond well to Anadrol, if you get great results from it, again, this is one I've tried that I didn't, but I might have kind of been kind of halfway there in terms of my limitations already. Yes, for the average user that does do well on Anadrol, it makes a lot more sense at the beginning. Of course, Pharmaqo does non-steroidal options, and these are products that could be used as part of a cycle. I would actually argue that the next two are way more likely to be considered finishers than kickstarters. So oral options for non-steroidal options would be, for example, clenbuterol. We talk about dosage between 40 micrograms to 120 micrograms. We actually have a little sort of on and off all the way through that works for some users. And T3, Steve, would be the other one. Both of these, in my mind, if we're talking about kickstarting or finishing, I'm going to go with finishing. They would be effective from start to finish. They would be effective if you wanted to get into shape.
But on clean, you can't do it.
Finishing.
You can't
I would say
clean.
finishing. Yeah,
but you can't do clean the whole way. It's
yes,
too
that's
brutal.
what I'm thinking, and I wouldn't.
So you got to do 2 weeks on.
Either of them. Yeah, I think this level of discomfort makes it a bad idea for me. So finishing to get into shape, the cutting makes way more sense to finish than it does to kickstart. What do you think?
Yeah, so in the clan, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, as a lot of people will do. It's just too brutal on your heart. So I don't know if I think you should start it, at some point during the cycle, just to get your fat burning where you want it to go. So a lot of people use clenbuterol for that reason. A lot of competitors will use clenbuterol just throughout. So it'd be both. You start with the clen and then just run it throughout. It might be better to start with the clen, because this way the other side effects on the other steroids won't be hitting you so hard yet. So that's what I do. But with clen, you just gotta play it by ear, because if you start getting, the irregular heartbeat and the heartburn and all these side effects, these are real side effects. Yeah, you gotta just start. I'm not a big fan of clen, but they do have it available. A lot of people like it. T3 messes with your thyroid. It's gonna speed up your thyroid. I'm not a big fan of that either. But let's face it, pro bodybuilders, they will use T3 to give themselves an edge over their competition. So they'll start at 25 micrograms and then work their way up from there. And at the end of the day, with T3, obviously that one, I agree with you, Mobster. Finisher makes more sense because you want your thyroid really humming going into the competition. So
I'll tell you what it is as well, Steve. I think there's the thing that we sometimes forget is the condition of the athlete or the person doing these products. I would want you to be in some kind of shape already. I don't want you to be using these, especially from start to finish or as a Kickstarter, etc. If you're out of shape, the end game is don't come in here 25, 30% body fat and think that you're going to be absolutely in there. So think of that. Your results would be better if you're leaner. I want to talk briefly, Steve, where we've just got a minute or so left, about Pharmaqo itself and why we think it's a great thing. Look, Steve, on the show research, I'm looking at 151 products. That's with the American options, so the domestic market as well as international. So it's probably closer to 100, 120. That is still a huge amount of products. With, as I say, Femavar being not that common in terms of the labs that we look at, etc., etc. I'm looking at the product quality here, Steve, in terms of the appearance, which is great. I like the dosaging that they've got. I like the fact that I'm just looking here at trends, Steve, and I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think it's 4, 5, maybe 6 different trend options just on the one page that I'm looking at. That's in terms of esters, that's in terms of dosaging. So we like this kind of stuff. We like clean-looking, medical-looking products. We like well-dosed products that they've done the work for you. We like the fact that these companies have been around long enough to establish themselves for a great result. So very briefly, Steve, give your thoughts on Pharmaqo before we go to the disclaimer.
Yeah, they have great shipping. They have great customer service. They have great products. I mean, what else could you ask for? And this is why their popularity is growing. They're one of the top brands out there. I use them. I recommend them to my clients. And they're definitely a top tier brand. We don't talk about anything less on this podcast, Mobster, than A+ quality products.
I think we should talk more about Pharmaqo, Steve. I think as a brand, it needs to be identified by more users. And guys, come and check their company out. Come and check their products out. See what they've got available. Have a look at them. Again, we know people that are using this product. Steve's talked about recommending it to clients. You don't recommend products to clients that you don't think will be effective or that those probably, or they're hygienic. And they're just as a company in and of themselves, just the sheer length of time that they've been in the marketplace. They're a growing brand. I think more of our listeners need to check them out and let us know what they think about their products. What about kickstarting finishers, guys? Tell us your thoughts. What would you do? Have you done things different from what we discussed? Have you had to change cycles through? Let us know what you think and how your thoughts on how you would have done it versus what we talked about today. Please note, we are not doctors and the opinions are ours. It is our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.